On a perfect July morning in Normandy, the air felt like a promise. Blue sky, a warm wind off the hedgerows, the scent of cut grass and damp earth. Men in foxholes adjusted their helmets and expected another routine day of hedgerow fighting. Shell fire, patrols, the slow grinding attrition that had defined the campaign since D-Day. Nothing in that calm smelled of catastrophe. Then, the horizon darkened with wings. It was not a trick of sight. Thousands of aircraft, a tide of metal and canvas and fuel, moved coherently across the channel. From the ground, the sound reached first as a high keening, then a thunder that swallowed other noises. For some units, the sight of those bomber streams meant salvation. For others, it would mean ruin. Over the course of 96 hours, an operation designed to break a stalemate would do precisely that, but not only to the German front. According to the transcript, nearly 3,000 Allied aircraft were committed across the sector, and more than 4,000 tons of explosives fell in the days that followed. What began as a concentrated effort to punch a hole in enemy lines would, in a matter of days, destroy one of Germany's most elite armored formations, the division the transcript calls Panzer, commanded by Fritz Bohlein. The consequences were immediate, operational, and human. A professional nucleus of tank instructors, demonstration troops, and veteran armored crews erased from the battlefield in less than a week. If you want more deep battlefield breakdowns like this, hit subscribe. We unpack forgotten moments of World War II history. They were, by design and reputation, different from a standard line unit. Panzer had been assembled as a showcase, men who had taught the army how to fight tanks, instructors pulled from training schools and demonstration units. According to the transcript, its ranks contained an unusually high proportion of veterans, men who had fought across multiple fronts and then been gathered into a formation meant to model doctrine and technique. The division's vehicles were top-tier, mechanized half-tracks for mobility, Panzer IVs that formed the backbone of its medium armor, and the Panther tanks, where present, represented Germany's technical answer to Allied armor. The division trained together, repartee between crews honed by instruction rather than replacement drafts. That concentration of experience made the unit tactically sophisticated, crews who understood gunnery, recovery under fire, maintenance discipline, and the fragile art of coordinated armored infantry assaults in close country. It made them valuable. It also made their loss disproportionately damaging to the German war effort. To understand why the destruction of a single division mattered, imagine not just the loss of men and metal, but the wrecking of an institutional brain trust. The instructors who survived in 1944 could have, in theory, been fed back into the training network to seed competence across the reconstituted force.
Taken together, the division was not merely a formation on a map. It was a repository of tactical knowledge, doctrine, and experience that could not be quickly replaced. The transcript stresses this point. The Panzer Division had been selected, concentrated, and moved to the front as an elite reserve. Concentrating the best made them the logical target for an enemy seeking decisive rupture. The ground they marched toward favored defenders. Normandy's bocage, the tangled hedgerows and narrow lanes, had turned the Allied advance into a daily slog. Small fields were partitioned by earthbanks and thick vegetation. Visibility was poor, long-range maneuver limited, and ambushes multiplied the cost of any daylight movement. Allied infantry and armor found themselves fighting platoon by platoon, field by field. Casualties mounted and momentum stalled. By mid-July, the front had hardened into a line where small tactical successes failed to compose a strategic breakthrough. Rear area supplies clogged narrow lanes. Artillery fire could not produce decisive shifts, and commanders on both sides argued over reserves, timings, and the best way to extract advantage from a static and stubborn battlefield. For Allied commanders, men like Omar Bradley and the Corps commander known in the transcript as Lightning Joe Collins, the problem was simple in theory and fiendish in practice. The American armies had to break the German line and do it decisively before German reinforcements could be fed in or the campaign metastasized into another year of attrition. The solution they settled on combined two brutal but complementary elements of Allied superiority: air power and armored mobility. The plan would be blunt and spectacular: carpet bombing to crater and destroy a selected strip of the German front, followed immediately by a massed armored thrust through the blown open terrain. The bombing would neutralize entrenched defenses, sever communications, and, in its ideal outcome, leave only disorganized survivors for the armor to overrun. Such a scheme relied on precision in timing and faith in the ability of ground commanders to exploit openings before the enemy recovered. Planning for Operation Cobra, this concentrated assault, was therefore a study in balancing risk. Bradley viewed the gamble as necessary. Only a powerful punch could capitalize on Allied air superiority and a buildup of armor behind the beaches. Collins, who commanded the corps tasked with the immediate exploitation, favored speed and boldness. According to the transcript, their intent was to use overwhelming aerial weight to do what artillery had been unable to achieve, to open a clean, deep corridor through which tanks could surge and roll the German wing up from the flank. They selected a narrow rectangular target on the map, a corridor that would concentrate the destructive force and, they believed, maximize the chance of a single, decisive rupture.
Yet the plan depended on a brittle sequence: clean weather for bomber formation, clear radio channels for target marking, synchronized timing so that bombs fell where friendly troops were not yet moving forward, and rapid coordination between ground units ready to exploit the gaps. Each link in that chain had failure modes. Communication across different services, Army ground units and Army Air Force's bombers, was imperfect. Weather in the English Channel could turn operations on their head, and the line between a successful carpet and catastrophic friendly fire was thin. Weather and radio static made one small mistake into an unimaginable catastrophe, the transcript reports, and that fragility would prove decisive. For the German side, the problem was strategic and political. Reserve armored formations could not be released with the fluidity commanders ideally desired. Centralized release protocols, deference to the high command, and even Hitler's personal prerogatives often delayed movement. A gap of hours could turn a local counterattack into a missed opportunity. The Panzer Division, summoned west to answer the Allied pressure, had already taken its share of wear on the roads. Colonels and platoon leaders reported damaged vehicles, crews sleeping in shifts, and replacements that had not yet been blooded. Delays during movement, report confusion, traffic jams on narrow lanes, costly refueling stops eroded the unit's initial strength. The concentration that made Panzer so valuable also made it vulnerable. When large numbers of vehicles move on a few narrow lanes, a single aerial strike or a series of artillery barrages could create bottlenecks and turn roads into graves. Fritz Bohlen had been sent to command this formation at the front. In the transcript, his name appears not as a glorified figure, but as a human being placed in an impossible position. From his headquarters, he watched reports come in, descriptions of incoming bomber formations, fragments of radio messages, men unable to locate the exact axis of advance. The vulnerability was not just in metal and fuel, it was in the nervous system of command. The transcript records Bohlen's perspective as fragmented, precise, human. He looked at the map, at the icons representing his regiments and battalions, and thought like an instructor who had spent a life correcting small errors, an extra minute in a convoy schedule, a misread waypoint, a delayed order. Those details multiplied into catastrophe once the sky filled. Up in the sky, the Americans were trying to corral the elements into the tight choreography they required. According to the transcript, the bomber force slated for the initial strike on July 24 and 25 included, in one account, roughly 1,500 heavy bombers, supported by an even larger number of medium bombers and fighters. In another regional accounting, the total number of aircraft committed across the sector approached 3,000. The tonnage of explosives, concentrated on a comparatively narrow zone of hedgerows and lanes, measured in thousands of tons. The transcript cites more than 4,000 tons falling across the period and sector. These were industrial quantities of destruction. A single heavy bomber could carry several tons of ordnance. The cumulative effect was to turn an agricultural landscape into a bombed moonscape in hours. The difficulty was targeting. Carpet bombing in close terrain is blunt by design. Bombers form, line up on a grid, and release on brief markers, trusting the numbers and concentric effects to do the work. In open desert or boundless steppe, the pattern yields a bar of destruction with margins. In bocage, with troops hidden in small sunken lanes and hedgerows hugging narrow roads, the margin for error collapsed. Mistimed runs, navigational drift, and pilot perception could all mean ordnance falling where friends would move. The plan had a built-in assumption that the preparatory bombardment would come down cleanly ahead of advancing infantry, that forward observers and drop markers would be accurate, that weather and radio would cooperate. Those assumptions did not always hold. On July 24, weather forced a halt. Cloud ceilings spooled over the channel, and the first attempt at the strike had to be scrubbed. For men in foxholes, a cancelled strike was a reprieve. For commanders planning exploitation, it was delay. A second chance came on July 25th, and with it, the risks of hurried timing. According to the transcript, some bomber formations aborted, some misread marks, and a smaller but critical number of aircraft dropped ordnance short of the designated line. The narrow margin between clearing friendly positions and devastating one's own troops was breached. The morning of the strike had the look of an ordinary dawn until the sky filled with wings. Ernie Pyle, identified in the transcript as Ernie Pyle, the correspondent who moved with the troops, had a foxhole on the ridge that overlooked one flank of the target zone. His dispatches, as recorded in the account, are immediate and sensory. The world erased by light and concussion, a smell that was not just cordite, but earth turned over and fired. He wrote about being pinned under the thunder of his own side's bombs and watching men he knew go rigid in the blast. Pyle's perspective offered the American human counterpoint to Bohling's anxious map reading. Where Bohling worried about logistics and the loss of institutional competence, Pyle registered the physical shock of industrialized warfare, the way a farm could be unmade in a single pass of wings. There were early signs of confusion even before the detonation. Radio chatter captured moments of hesitation, fighter controllers asking whether an axis had been cleared, infantry commanders noting a delay in the scheduled barrage, and bomber navigators requesting confirmation of their rally points. According to the transcript, some of those checks failed. Another set of the bombers, either due to misnavigation or miscommunication, turned toward the wrong coordinates and released ordnance short of the intended line. Then the bombs began. It is difficult to describe the economy of scale in audible terms. A single blast can be narrated as a shock. 1,000 blasts overlap and produce an atmosphere. Fields disappeared beneath smoke. Hedgerows crumpled like folded paper. Roads filled with inverted soil. The ground seemed to vibrate with a frequency that set teeth on edge. Men who had heard artillery for months said later that the bombing carried a different register. It was not an artillery melody, but industrial upheaval, the sound of a factory tearing the landscape open. Craters formed in quick succession until the hedgerow country looked less like a sequence of parcels than a lunar surface, pocked, bewildering, and instantly unfamiliar. The carpet bombing achieved some of its operational goals. Many German bunkers, entrenched positions, and supply nodes were destroyed or neutralized. Communications lines, already fragile, snapped under the blast. Command posts were disrupted. In the chaos that followed, units found themselves isolated from one another. According to the transcript, the shock produced an immediate reduction in German command cohesion. Local leaders could not reliably contact brigade or battalion headquarters. Orders arrived late or not at all, and the carefully trained networks that had once knit armored operations together were shredded into ad hoc groupings. But the bombing also had immediate and tragic consequences on the Allied side. In the fog of war, with a selective bad luck in timing and alignment, some bombs fell short of the target zone and landed among American positions. The transcript records that friendly fire incidents occurred during the strike, including the death of a senior American general. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, a high-ranking and respected officer in the American chain of command, was killed in the aftermath, his death later reported to have been caused by the bombing and its shrapnel. The transcript frames this as a somber and significant loss, and the incident became an emblem of the operation's perilous edge, strategic intent colliding with the brutal imprecision of massed aerial fire. Combat commanders had to confront the paradox that the very force meant to blow open a hole for infantry and armor could also slice through their own. On the German side, the immediate picture was one of disorientation and survival. Units that had expected to fight in hedgerows instead had their world rearranged by craters and broken communications. Fuel and ammunition convoys jammed on destroyed lanes. Recovery and repair units, those who kept tanks moving, found their tasks made near impossible by smashed bridges and mud-filled craters.
Where the division's doctrine assumed mobility and the ability to withdraw and counterattack, the terrain left by the bombardment often arrested movement and created kill zones along the few remaining passable routes. Tanks and half-tracks that could have shot their way out of a trap instead found themselves immobile, their tracks gouged by bomb craters and treads clogged with churned clay. Amid the mechanical and tactical failure, there were human moments layered inside the rubble. Fritz Bohling, in the transcript's portrait, moved among aides and maps and shouted into telephones that sometimes produced only static. He witnessed squads digging survivors from overturned trucks, and he watched junior officers try to form coherent defensive perimeters in towns that had, 24 hours earlier, been farming communities. In one dispatch, recorded as reported by Bohling in the transcript, he noted the surreal contrast. Men who had trained to teach armored doctrine now improvising with small arms, throwing together anti-tank positions out of whatever debris remained. The transformation was not just physical, it was doctrinal. Institutional habits of combined arms maneuver gave way to raw, improvised defensive acts. The American response, as Collins and his staff had planned, was to exploit the induced disorder quickly.
Speed was the currency. The sooner armor rolled through the breached line, the less chance German commanders would have to reconstitute control. Collins took the gamble of committing armored columns into a landscape still partially under the bombardment's sway. According to the transcript, he believed that the cost of moving quickly outweighed the risk of moving into a shattered, cratered zone, a bitter calculus, because the very craters that had cleared the way of bunkers now made maneuver difficult and hazardous. Those first armored drives were not graceful passages. Tanks rode over broken farm roads, often forced to single file behind narrow stretches of passable ground. The craters funneled vehicles, turning columns into long trains easily targeted by surviving enemy artillery and by fighters turned to ground attack missions. Yet the panic and loss of coordination among German units opened opportunities. Armored spearheads found gaps, bypassed isolated strongpoints, and sought to unhinge the German lateral lines of communication. The transcript emphasizes that once the armor exploited the initial breach, the velocity of the American advance compounded German disorder. Where the bombardment had fragmented command, the armor's tempo prevented reconstitution. Between the bombing and the armored push, a peculiar, cruel quality of this episode emerges. Many of the tactical facts that confirmed Allied advantage were also the sources of immediate suffering. The same aircraft that destroyed a German dugout could also carry an errant bomb that killed an American colonel or sergeant.
The craters that stopped a German counterattack could simultaneously trap an armored recovery vehicle and its crew. Warfare had long ceased to be a duel of skill. It had become an interplay of expertise and industrial scale. According to the transcript, over 70% of one element of the division's combat strength, reported as a casualty rate for personnel and vehicles combined in that account, was rendered combat ineffective in the days that followed. That figure, repeated in after-action evaluations, signaled more than a temporary setback. It represented a structural loss of combat capability. Reports from the front mixed the clinical and the personal. American medics, overwhelmed and exposed, attempted to triage wounded men where they lay. German crews, battered and in retreat in pockets, surrendered in groups or melted back into the bocage in search of escape routes. Correspondents like Ernie Pyle recorded both. In one of his accounts, relayed in the transcript, he described the surreal sight of American infantry walking through near-sterile wastelands of churned earth, pausing as if to check that boots still had purchase on ground once sturdy and known. He wrote of the quiet that came after the heaviest passes of bombers. For a few minutes the world was eerily still, as if the bombing had suspended time itself. Even with that stillness, the clock was not on German side. The first 96 hours, what the transcript frames as a nightmare, were not just an exercise in volume. They were a test of will and process. Commanders on both sides felt the heat of compressed decision-making. For Boline, the crisis was a matter of survival for men he had trained and the loss of the institutional expertise they represented. For Collins and Bradley, the operation balanced on a razor. Exploit too slowly and the Germans might recover. Move too fast and the columns risked walking into still dangerous pockets of resistance or friendly fire zones. The fragility of coordination, the randomness of bomb impacts, and the human costs of both success and error all gathered into that 96-hour crucible. As the first morning passed into an acrid afternoon, the landscape of Normandy had changed. Farms that had been landmarks were unrecognizable. Roads that had once been channels of supply were rutted in practicalities. Communication lines hung broken like frayed ropes. Men on both sides struggled with the same primary questions. Where were your neighbors? Who had authority? How to move under the threat of falling ordnance? In a kind of perverse symmetry, the scale of destruction that enabled the Anglo-American breakthrough also created conditions that amplified the war's cruelty. Friendly fire, shattered villages, and troops who thought not with doctrine but with improvisation. By the time dusk folded the hedgerows into shadow, the initial objectives had been achieved in part. A breach existed, and American armor had begun to funnel through. Yet the cost and the chaos was not contained. Commanders who had hoped for a clean corridor now faced a world of broken communications, displaced units, and thousands of wounded and dying. For Panzer, the division that had arrived as a concentrated reserve of professional tankers, the first blows had already been devastating. Crew replacements, repair parts, and the ability to form coordinated counterstrokes had been severely compromised. The transcript records in stark terms the scale. Significant percentages of crew and vehicle strength were disabled in those first hours, and the loss would not simply be numerical. The training cadres, the instructors whose knowledge differentiated Panzer from other units, had been dispersed or killed. The division's institutional competence, its capacity to teach other units, to repair and reconstitute armored doctrine, was damaged, perhaps beyond easy recovery. Night did not bring normalcy. It brought patchwork efforts to organize defenses, to bury the dead, to tally losses. Staff officers attempted to draw maps from memory, to locate scattered subunits, and to find fuel where supply columns had been broken. American units established ad hoc forward supply nodes. Bomb craters had to be bridged or bypassed. Medical teams improvised triage under shell fire. Commanders wrote dispatches that would later be parsed for blame or praise. Men, exhausted and shaken, traded whispery accounts of the morning's thunder. In quiet corners of shattered villages, survivors tried to reconstruct their options. Those hours of recovery would feed into the next day and the one after. Yet for all the immediate dislocation, an operational logic guided the Allies' next moves. Sustain pressure, avoid pausing to count costs, exploit the broken chain of command before it healed. The concept of operational tempo, rapid movements that prevent an opponent from restoring order, was central. If the Panzer Division had lost cohesion, the Allies needed to move to maximize that advantage. For the Germans, the imperative was reversal, to find a seam, to gather dispersed tanks and counterattack before the Allied armor fully poured through. The coming hours would test whether the first blow could be consolidated into a decisive unfolding campaign, or whether the initial carnage would settle into a new, bloody equilibrium. At headquarters, for Balin and his staff, the night brought unwelcome calculations. He could count men and tanks, but could not measure the erosion of doctrine. How many instructors were gone? How many crews irretrievably broken? How many years of accumulated knowledge were scattered into the dirt? The transcript frames this loss as not merely tactical, but strategic. The effective annihilation of core expertise in the space of days would leave a void that replacement efforts could not easily fill.
The Germans had industrial capacity to manufacture tanks. They did not have an industrial way to manufacture instructors, or the sort of combat-seasoned judgment that welds crews into a functioning unit. And so the stage was set. The 96-hour clock had begun to run. By the time the second dawn in that arc arrived, the map of Normandy was no longer the same. Some places would never recover their pre-bombing character. Units that had been counted on for counterattacks no longer existed in anything resembling organized form. The Allies had cracked open a hole and were preparing to widen it. The human and institutional costs, counted in dead, wounded, lost vehicles, and the destruction of trained personnel, would leave marks on the rest of the campaign. But the story of those first hours was not finished. The bombardment had produced both tactical opportunity and terrible accidents. Leaders on both sides were about to make decisions that would either capitalize on or mitigate the unfolding catastrophe. The morning after the first massive passes revealed both the scale of the physical damage and the deeper fissures of command. Survivors on both sides scoured the wreckage for functioning radios and any coherent orders. American armor, pressured by Collins to move with immediacy, began to thread through lanes that still smoked, moving past collapsed walls and over shattered bridges. German units, their cohesion eroded, began to form pockets of resistance rather than the organized whole that Bolin once commanded. For the Panzer Division, the tactical picture was simple and brutal. Isolated pockets, ruined vehicles, scattered survivors. The division that had once been a teaching cadre was dispersing into survival. And yet, the Allies still faced perilous choices. The very craters that undermined German movement also threatened Allied columns. Route discipline was difficult under fire. Single roads turned into choke points. Fighter bombers, now free to strike moving columns, added to the destructive mix. The operational gamble that Collins had placed on speed now required not only courage but exact real-time judgment. Judgment in a landscape of broken maps and missing radio calls. Unfolding across that battered countryside was a painful lesson in the limits of expertise against massed firepower. The Panzer Division had been made by men and minds. It had been destroyed by the aggregate effect of ordnance, weather, miscommunication, and the sheer weight of industrial war. In those first 48 hours, the seeds of collapse had been sown. There would be counterattacks, desperate local fights, and attempts to regroup, but the nature of the division's losses suggested a deeper erosion, the dispersal of knowledge, the severing of mentorship chains, and the replacement of doctrinal competence with ad hoc survival tactics. As the second day of the operation dawned, the Allies prepared to press the advantage.
Commanders at all levels understood the stakes. Sustain the tempo, widen the breach, prevent the Germans from reforming a coherent defensive line. The Germans, meanwhile, searched for ways to plug the gaps with scraps, hastily assembled ad hoc groups, local counterstrikes, and attempts to move whatever heavy weapons they could salvage into positions that might deny the Americans easy passage. On the battered roads, men who had trained alongside each other months before were no longer the same fighting body.
Tanks that still rolled bore the scars of close calls, their crews dazed and exhausted. Recovery vehicles worked under fire to free trucks and tanks. Mechanics improvised fixes from scavenged parts. For Bolin, each passing hour made the prospect of rebuilding more remote. The division's survivors could not simply be counted and sent home to retrain replacements. The institutional memory had been disrupted in ways that would manifest later. Less effective training back in reserve, fewer qualified instructors for new armored units, and a trickle of degradation across the German armored arm that could not be reversed quickly. Still, the Allies had not yet cleaned the pocket. Pockets of resistance remained stubborn, and the nature of bocage fighting meant that even a shattered division could inflict local costs. For every tank the Americans destroyed by massed air and artillery, there remained an instance where a hidden anti-tank gun or a detached crew could stall a column for hours. Those local halts fed into the larger calculus. Speed was necessary, but speed into uncharted craters and broken roads was itself hazardous. It is in this interstitial between the first thunder and the full exploitation that the true agony of the operation lay. Strategy collided with the unpredictable. Navigation errors, miscommunication, the death of the senior officer by friendly ordnance. The transcript frames these events not as aberrations, but as the tragic contingencies of industrialized combined arms, an operational model that could produce stunning gains, but also excruciating losses in the blink of an eye. As the afternoon light slanted and hedgerow shadows lengthened, both sides pressed the best parts of their surviving faculties into action. The Allies sought to widen and hold the breach. The Germans tried to gather remnants and counterattack where possible. Behind both sets of troops, the administrative engines churned, supply officers recalculating tonnage of fuel, medical officers improvising triage points, staff officers redrawing maps with the ink of a desperate necessity, and all the while the 96-hour clock ticked forward, impartial and relentless, toward an eventual resolution that neither side could fully foresee. The narrative of those first days is equal parts mechanical and human. There is the raw arithmetic of tonnage, aircraft numbers, and percentages. There is also the quieter arithmetic of experience lost and knowledge dissolved.
Panzer arrived as a concentrated answer to the German army's need for expertise. The bombardment and the sequence of events that followed stripped that concentration away. The result was an operational and moral paradox, a decisive opening at the cost of grievous losses, both intended and accidental. The next phase, where armored exploitation would meet the remaining German resistance head-on, where commanders would push their advantage while the craters still smoked, was about to begin. The first 96 hours had already reshaped the battlefield. What remained was to see whether the Allies could convert rupture into strategic envelopment, and whether the German army, deprived of its tactical nucleus in Panzer, could assemble a coherent counter. The clock kept moving, and with it the fates of formations, towns, and the men who had thought themselves prepared for war, only to find that preparation sometimes met a kind of modern thunder for which no doctrine could fully account. Dawn after the first day was not a calm of victory so much as a suspension. The earth smoked, men counted, and the unequal arithmetic of advantage and loss began to resolve. The Americans had punched a hole. Now they had to widen it before the Germans could re-knit a defense. For Fritz Bohlein and the remnants of Panzer, the hours that followed were a shrinking of options. Movement measured in inches, command measured in desperate phone calls, doctrine replaced by improvisation. At first light on the 26th, American armor moved like water, seeking the path of least resistance. Collins's calculus was simple and brutal: speed. Where the hedgerows still offered cover, they could conceivably stall in advance. Where the ground had been turned into a moonscape, the risk of entrapment was real. Collins judged that the fragmentation among German units and the shattered communications that the bombardment had produced were a weight tipping toward opportunity. Tanks and mechanized columns threaded narrow lanes and forced their way across damaged roads, sometimes single file, sometimes separated by miles of churned fields. Fighter bombers, released from the task of massed formation bombing, flew in low and struck at German columns on the move. Artillery, that had been freed from the need to support a stuttering infantry advance, shifted its fires into interdiction, shelling likely routes of withdrawal. The exploitation that began on the 26th had the conflicting character of ballet and carnage. Maneuver was by necessity flamboyant and crude. Armored columns overrunning farmland, bypassing stubborn pockets, seeking to cleave lateral lines of communication and cut the German wing in two. At the same time, the battlefield's new geometry, the cratered ground, the bridges smashed or clogged, the hedgerows turned into walls of earth, transformed straightforward plans into exercises in on-the-spot adaptation. Tanks bogged in churned clay. Recovery crews could not reach them. Stranded vehicles became stationary targets for strafing runs. Supply lines stretched thin as fuel and munitions crawled forward across roads that now required constant repair. The tempo of the operation depended on the ability of staff officers to improvise fuel dumps, to find alternate lateral routes, to keep the mechanics and drivers moving at the rate that Collins demanded. German resistance was courageous but fragmented. Where units had preserved command links, they mounted local counterattacks, attempted ambushes, and tried to delay the armored tide. Where command had broken, small groups of survivors fell back to farmsteads, woods, and hedgerow islands, setting up ad hoc anti-tank positions with scavenged guns and Molotov improvisations. The transcript paints a picture of pockets resisting with ferocity and then dissolving under combined air, artillery, and armor pressure. These were not coordinated corps actions. They were fragments of a formation trying to hold their honor and lives in the face of a rising tide. Bowline's staff recorded attempts to gather tanks for local counterstrokes. The division's recovery units worked into the night to clear lanes, to tow disabled vehicles, to get what fuel they could into operational tanks. But the record the transcript reports is stark. By the close of the initial exploitation period, a majority of the division's heavy equipment and personnel were combat ineffective. The figures cited in the transcript, over 70 fighter bombers began to turn every slow-moving target into an object of destruction. According to the transcript, Allied air power during this period was liberated from the constraint of single-line carpet bombing and became a continuous, mobile threat. Dive bombers and fighters working in close coordination with advancing armor to deny movement and sanctuary. It is important to register the way mechanized and air elements complemented each other during the exploitation, because that dynamic explains both the speed of the American advance and the depth of German disintegration. Bombers had opened the line. Fighters, rocket-equipped attack planes, and artillery kept the rear in chaos. Tanks could not be recovered, resupplied, or rejoined to form a counterstroke in any coherent fashion if every likely route of approach was under the threat of air attack. What remained of Panzer found itself losing the means to swing back. Mechanical capability, logistic networks, and radio nestings, all essential to armored doctrine, were severed in sequence. Human stories threaded through these operational facts. A German panzer crew, unnamed in the transcript, dragged a wounded driver from a burning half-track, only to be strafed by a fighter and forced to surrender. In a farmyard converted into a makeshift command post, a junior lieutenant attempted to assemble a defensive line from remnants of 2 companies. His maps were outdated because his radio batteries had been destroyed the day before. An American tank commander, his vehicle pitted and patched from previous fights, had a moment of bewildered pity when he saw a band of German instructors, men older and dirtier than line troops, saluting as they were led away. These instances, small and harrowing, are the human grain inside the mechanical narrative, faces, voices, and gestures that transform the arithmetic of tonnage and percentages into the lived experience of men under extreme duress. The fall of Avranches, a pivotal geographical marker, came in this window. As the exploitation widened and the lateral German lines were severed, the Allied drive toward the Cotentin Peninsula and the base of the Brittany approaches gained momentum. According to the transcript, the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows toward Avranches and beyond was accelerated by the collapse of the elite division's ability to act as a coherent countervailing force. Once the pocketing and slicing could produce open routes and the threat of envelopment loomed, German resistance became a series of reactive moves rather than proactive problem-solving. Patton's Third Army is often invoked in the narrative of the breakout, and the transcript reports that the route enabled by Cobra's initial punch and the ensuing exploitation allowed Patton's forces to exploit interior lines and move rapidly through the fractured German rear. Once the Americans had a secure corridor, the logistics train, fuel, ammunition, repair parts, could be pushed forward with greater intensity. Once Patton moved, speed alone multiplied the strategic consequences. For the German army, the loss was not just of ground and materiel, it was the loss of initiative. Where once it expected to be able to parry and counter, it now faced an opponent with lines of communication and massed maneuveral reach that could turn flank into rout within hours. Encirclements multiplied in the days between July 26 and July 30. Small German formations, cut off from supply and command, surrendered in groups or attempted desperate breakouts. Where they tried to fight their way through, aircraft and artillery sheared them apart. The transcript describes numerous pockets destroyed or captured, and repetitively notes the moral toll on crews who had been instructors only weeks earlier. Men who had taught tank recovery, live fire discipline, and crew cohesion found themselves outgunned, outmanned, and outmaneuvered. The psychological shock of seeing one's own doctrine fail under the weight of industrialized destruction was palpable in accounts recorded by both sides. Equipment losses were heavy and swift. The transcript lists percentages and totals that map bleakly onto the division's operational capacity. Tanks burned where they stood or were abandoned in craters. Half-tracks were halved by strafing and shell.
Repair and recovery vehicles were lost in the chaos or left to be scavenged by victors. Even where tanks could be towed back, the logistical chain for repair, the spare parts, the heavy cranes, had been disrupted. The industrial capacity of Germany might have replaced hardware in the long run, but the human and institutional capital of trained crews and instructors could not be recreated overnight. The transcript's repeated emphasis, over 70% combat ineffective, thus signaled a damage that would echo long after hulls were replaced. Beyond the immediate destruction, there was a cascading operational effect. The division had been an elite reserve in the German defensive plan precisely because it could be used to hit back hard at penetrations or to shore up weak sectors. The removal of that reserve reduced German flexibility across a broader front. Commanders further north and east, who might have expected a relief in the form of a trained counterattack, found their options thinner. The transcript reports that the loss of experienced crews and instructors rippled into training establishments. Fewer qualified NCOs and officers returned to training centers. Fewer experienced gunnery instructors remained to pass on the practical tacit knowledge that differentiates a functional crew from a paper one. In the high-pressure environment of 1944, such deficiencies translated quickly into battlefield weakness. On the Allied side, there were costs too, both immediate and moral.
Friendly fire casualties had been recorded during the initial strike, and the death of Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair remained a symbol of that bitter paradox, command decisions interacting with the fog of war in fatal ways. The transcript repeatedly frames McNair's death as one of the somber footnotes of the campaign, a reminder that even decisive operations carried internal price tags. Medics and chaplains were stretched unimaginably thin. Hospital trains overflowed. Field surgeons worked in impossible conditions. Even as the strategic horizon brightened for Allied commanders, breakout, exploitation, operational depth, the human burden of the assault was heavy and immediate. The days that followed the initial exploitation served to consolidate the gains. By logically connecting the corridor created by bombing and the momentum of armored thrusts, Allied commanders encircled and reduced pockets, seized supply nodes, and pushed toward critical junctions. The German ability to mount a coordinated defense was, as the transcript notes, compromised not only by losses of men and equipment, but by the erosion of staff capacity. Signals, the nervous system of modern warfare, had been disrupted. Radios were destroyed, antenna farms were rubble, cipher materials were lost. Without a functioning staff to coordinate, even available units became locally reactive. By July 30, the 96-hour window, the period the transcript frames as the crucial crucible, had run its course and delivered a strategic reshaping. The elite division, Panzer, existed no longer as an operationally coherent whole. The veteran instructors who had formed its backbone were dead, captured, wounded, or dispersed. Tanks could be counted and, in some cases, replaced later. The tacit knowledge those instructors embodied, how to mend a jammed turret under fire, how to train a new crew in hours rather than weeks, how to coordinate armor and infantry in broken hedgerow spaces, could not be rebuilt simply by a mandate from the factory. The transcript insists on this point. The destruction was not only of metal, but of a concentrated body of experience. Operationally, the breakthrough had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate sector. Avranches had been taken. The route to the interior of France had opened. Patton's forces exploited the vacuum, moving with a tempo that the Germans could not match. Strategic reserves were committed piecemeal in attempts to blunt the drive, but without the Panzer Division's trained nucleus available as a counterpunch, those attempts often lacked cohesion. The momentum of August would see rapid Allied advances that reshaped the Western Front. The transcript frames Cobra and its 96-hour aftermath as a turning point in the Normandy campaign. A concentrated application of combined arms, air power and armor, achieved the decisive crack that months of hedgerow attrition could not. Yet even decisive operations leave wounds.
The moral calculus of the breakout is complex. The Allies had, by weight and coordination of fire, solved a strategic impasse and liberated large swaths of territory. But the operation's human toll, dead, wounded, and scared on both sides, was immense. The friendly fire tragedies, the towns reduced to rubble, and the psychological trauma inflicted upon survivors on both sides complicate any simple narrative of triumph. The transcript's tone is unambiguous in stressing both the military success and its attendant suffering. Where the operation produced strategic breakthrough, it also produced scenes of chaos, loss of command, and fractured lives. Moreover, the long-term German effort to rebuild armored capability was hampered not merely by factories or fuel shortages, but by the erosion of trained personnel. The instructors had been a multiplier.
Their presence elevated the skill of replacement crews, accelerated repairs under fire, and mentored inexperienced crews during campaigns. Without that multiplier, the German armored arms' effectiveness degraded in ways that were measurable in subsequent battles. The transcript warns that hardware alone cannot substitute for battlefield-seasoned leadership and practical, experience-grounded instruction. There were attempts to rebuild. Orders went out, replacements were issued where available, and the High Command tried to reconstitute what remained of Panzer under new layers of personnel. Tanks rolled off lines in workshops, and new slots were filled by drafts from other less experienced units. But the transcript emphasizes a qualitative loss. Newly minted crews could be taught gunnery drills and maintenance cycles in training grounds. They could not inherit the quiet confidence and improvisational judgment born of seasons of combat and instruction. The net effect was that while the German army could replace steel, it struggled to replace the institutional culture of competence that the lost instructors had embodied. For commanders like Belied, the aftermath played as a long grief. He kept notes, where recorded, that measured not only the loss of vehicles, but the disappearance of people he had known as colleagues and students. These were not rhetorical statements, they were practical calculations about the army's future. The transcript presents Belied not as a villain, but as a man whose professional identity had been invested in the making of effective tankers, and whose sorrow was that of a craftsman watching his workshop destroyed. This humanization is essential to the narrative. Competence and professional pride are not moral endorsement of a regime, they are the tools and values any soldier might bring to their craft. The transcript insists on that distinction. Analysis of professional ability need not be conflated with moral praise. Ernie Pyle's dispatches, referred to in the transcript, continue to provide human windows into the operation's grinding reality.
His notes, terse and sensory, followed Allied troops as they moved through cratered fields, past burning hulks, and into towns emptied of civilians or filled with refugees. In one of his accounts, cited in the transcript, he observed the quiet that followed the bombing, a hush in which each man listened for distant engines or the crack of a radioed order. Pyle's vantage, embedded and immediate, complemented the strategic view. It made clear that strategic success was measured in individual breaths and the small survivals of men and horses and machines. In the months that followed, historians and commanders would parse Cobra and the destruction of the elite division for lessons. The transcript itself frames several themes as enduring: the lethal synergy of air power and armor when properly synchronized, the danger of concentrating irreplaceable human capital in a single unit without adequate dispersion or contingency, the lethal fragility introduced by poor communication and the fog of war. It also highlighted the ethical and practical limits of massed aerial bombing in close terrain, especially when friendly forces moved close to the targeted lines. The death of McNair lingered in doctrinal debates as a cautionary tale. The more you scale up massed firepower, the more dangerous small errors become. For the German war effort, the sting of that 96-hour nightmare was strategic and cumulative. The battlefield's mechanics did not change overnight, and the Germans continued to fight with skill and courage in many subsequent engagements. Yet the cumulative effect of lost experienced cadres and the depletion of reserves underlined a steady erosion. Where once training pools had teemed with seasoned instructors, those pools began to run shallower. The transcript's insistence on the institutional loss reframes the tactical destruction. It was not merely a battle lost, it was an attrition of capability. Memory, too, would be shaped by this episode. Veterans on both sides carried images of the cratered countryside, the smell of turned earth, and the radio voices cut in mid-sentence. Newspapers and correspondents like Pyle transmitted fragments to a broader public. Official dispatches tallied numbers and sought to justify choices made in the crucible of days. Over time, the narrative tended to emphasize the breakout, the liberation, the strategic brilliance of exploiting air superiority. Less often did popular retellings dwell on the friendly fire tragedies, the local civilian suffering, and the obliteration of a formation specifically valued for its pedagogical role. The transcript pushes against easy narratives by insisting on all facets, the operational brilliance and the operational cost. A final, sobering observation recorded in the transcript concerns the nature of modern industrial war itself.
The scenario laid bare a fundamental mismatch that persists as a lesson. The measured, deliberative craft of professional soldiers and instructors can be overwhelmed by a leveled, massed application of destructive power. Expertise, training, and doctrine matter intensely, yet they are vulnerable to systems of destruction that operate with a different logic, scale, speed, and a kind of mechanical inevitability. That mismatch is not merely tactical, it is existential for formations that serve as repositories of knowledge. When the dust finally settled, the casualty lists and equipment tallies told one part of the story. The qualitative accounts of broken comms, lost instructors, and scattered units told the rest. The transcript's narrative makes plain that a decisive, concentrated operation, according to its plan and with the reported numbers of aircraft and tonnage, did what it intended. It broke the stalemate. But it also did what is often true of hard-edged military solutions. It exacted a human toll that reverberated across months and seasons. To close the arc cleanly, the 96 hours beginning with the massed bombing and ending with the deep American penetration reshaped Normandy's operational map. The division named as Panzer in the transcript ceased to function as the elite training nucleus it had been assembled to be. Commanders like Collins and Bradley achieved strategic relief of a stubborn front. Patton's subsequent moves leveraged that relief into sweeping operational exploitation. The Germans lost not only men and machines but concentrated expertise, an erosion of institutional competence that could not be fixed by factories alone. The human stories, Bowline watching his maps become meaningless, Pyle writing from a foxhole, crews surrendered or captured, anchor the numbers in lived experience. History is rarely clean. The rapid destruction of an elite force in under a week is a stark example of how modern firepower, command fragility, and the fog of war collide. In those 96 hours, the Allies demonstrated the terrible efficiency of coordinated air-ground operations. They also confronted the messiness of warfare: friendly fire, displaced civilians, shattered villages, and the suffering of soldiers trained to teach but forced to survive. The transcript's account leaves us with a complex verdict: operationally decisive, morally and humanly costly. If this deep dive moved you, like the video and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. It helps keep these stories alive.